Good morning, everyone who is here in the Press Club Brussels Europe, and to those following us on YouTube. Welcome to this press conference on the very important topic of poverty in the European Union, presented by Olivier de Schutter, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Olivier de Schutter is professor at the Belgian University of UC Louvain and at Sciences Po in Paris. He was the UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Food between 2008 and 2014, and a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights between 2015 and 2020. He is currently co-chair of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Professor de Schutter.
Many thanks. Good morning to all. Bienvenue à tous et toutes. So, thank you for being here. I would like to, first of all, thank the European institutions to have allowed this mission to take place, which I started on 25th of November and which is closing today, and during which I could meet a very large number of interlocutors from civil society, unions, people in poverty, but also from the various parts of the European Commission, including particularly Commissioner Nicolas Schmit, who was very open to our dialogue, and the Minister of Finance of Ireland, Pascal Donoghue, the President of the Eurogroup, and as such, the Chair of the Board of Governance of the European Stability Mechanism. I also met with officials from the European Central Bank and the European Investment Bank, and I have to say it was a very useful set of discussions we had to try to identify what the EU can do in combating poverty and reducing inequalities. The first finding is very simple. We have failed to fulfill our promises as they were made in 2010 under the Europe 2020 strategy, when the EU committed to reduce the number of people at risk of poverty by 20 million by 2020. We have failed to meet this target, and no new target until now has been set. There's been no successor to the Europe 2020 strategy. What is striking in this finding is that despite us being unable to reduce the numbers of people in poverty, growth has been steady throughout this period, and employment has been created until the recent pandemic crisis. So the finding is that growth and jobs creation will not be sufficient to adequately reduce poverty. Many people in poverty actually have not been able to benefit from overall progress, and because of illness, because of the difficulty to reconcile family responsibilities with professional life, because of a lack of qualifications, they've not been able to benefit from the jobs creation throughout this period. So we need something else. And the first question I asked my interlocutors was whether the Green Deal, the new growth strategy launched by the Commission on the 11th of December 2019, was the tool that would allow us to tackle the issue of poverty. Now, the Green Deal is a remarkable roadmap for the ecological transformation of Europe, and it does take into account the social dimensions, calling rightly for a just transition, taking into account social justice, but it is not an anti-poverty strategy. There are no targets related to the reduction of people at risk of poverty, nor is that the chief purpose of the Green Deal. We discussed the reasons why member states were failing to effectively address poverty. And here, the message that comes out from my discussions is that there are three structural constraints that are currently imposed on governments, making it very difficult for them to achieve more significant success. The first constraint is fiscal competition between the member states. Now, as we know, there is a lock in the treaties making it impossible to effectively harmonize corporate income tax rates across the EU, or to maintain high levels of progressive taxation on the wealthiest individuals. And as a result, countries still compete against one another to attract investors and to ensure that they can improve their external cost competitiveness by reducing taxation on businesses. Despite the Code of Conduct of 1997 on business taxation, that is monitored by a group, the Code of Conduct group established in that same year, we've seen a decrease in the average statutory corporate income tax of 11% over the past 20 years. So although the EU has adopted anti-tax avoidance directives and has tried to address the most blatant instances of unfair tax competition across the EU, we are failing to challenge this race to the bottom with respect to high wealth individuals' tax rates and with respect to the corporate income tax rates. And that means a very important loss of revenue for states that, of course, would need those revenues to finance public services and social policies. The second structural constraint is that some countries still are reluctant to increase wages and to increase the social contributions to be paid by employers in order to finance social security, because they fear that this again will damage the competitiveness of the businesses that they seek to attract. Now, there are constraints here also, because there is no possibility for the union to legislate on wages. But I do welcome the proposal of the European Commission filed on 28th of October 2020 for a new directive on adequate minimum wages across the EU, proposed by Commissioner Nicolas Schmit, and which I very much hope shall be agreed to by the member states, although we are now waiting for an opinion from the legal service of the Council of the EU concerning the choice of the legal basis for this proposed directive. That directive is very important. It, however, does no more than encourage states to have a harmonized approach towards how the minimum wage is set in the different member states. And it will not, of course, impose a similar minimum wage across the EU. And what is striking to me is that if member states were actually complying with their obligations under international human rights law, there would be an even more significant level of harmonization across the member states, but these standards from international human rights law are often neglected in how the proposals made in the EU are made. The third structural constraint has to do with the macroeconomic straitjacket imposed under the Stability and Growth Pact, adopted in 1997 as part of the Economic and Monetary Union. Now, across my discussions, I found there was a very strong consensus to rethink the Stability and Growth Pact that, as you know, was set aside in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The General Escape Clause was activated in order to give more freedom of maneuver to states. And my interlocutors, in the vast majority of them at least, believe that the SGP, the Stability and Growth Pact, should be rethought. My proposal is that we should insulate parts of the investments made by countries from the calculation of the annual public debt, public deficit and the public debt in relation to GDP, by allowing these states to invest in people, social investment in health, in education, in lifelong training, are not costs and should be treated rather as investments that can boost competitiveness and growth in the long term, and thus they should be exempted from those budgetary disciplines imposed on states. Now, the report I'm going to present, based on the mission I did, will also address, of course, the reactions of the EU to the COVID-19 pandemic. And much of the discussion focused on the next generation EU set of instruments, and particularly on the Recovery and Resilience Facility established for a total amount of 750 billion euros that should be spent between now and 2023. I had an excellent meeting with Céline Gower, the head of the task force under the Secretary General of the European Commission in charge of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And I also had discussions with representatives of the French government, the Spanish government, the Italian government, the Portuguese presidency of the Union, and the next Slovenian presidency, in order to discuss how member states could use the opportunity of the Recovery and Resilience Facility to boost the fight against poverty and encourage social inclusion. And here the two key messages that came back were the following. First, these national recovery and resilience plans that the member states should submit, as you know, before the end of April, and the first drafts of which have often been presented to the European Commission for the Commission to provide the first feedback, have often been improvised without much room for meaningful consultation, either with unions, social partners, or with NGOs, civil society, and especially people in poverty. And so the risk is that many of these plans will be ill-informed and not necessarily consistent with the expectations of people in poverty and their experience in being unable, for example, to benefit from the social allowances they are meant to be able to perceive and the support schemes put in place to meet the crisis. The second finding is that there is no set aside in the national recovery and resilience plans for social cohesion, unlike the greening of the economy and the digitalization of the economy, for which respectively 37% and 21% of the sums should be dedicated. There is no quota allocated for social inclusion, which is not per se a bad thing, because this, of course, means that social cohesion should be a transversal concern in everything states do using this money. But there is no clear methodology to assess that the investments made with the Recovery and Resilience Facility shall effectively reduce poverty and reduce inequalities. There's no guidance provided by the Commission to the member states. There's no duty to provide social impact assessments. There is no methodology that the member states are expected to use to ensure the investments will benefit people in poverty. Therefore, I hope that such guidance can be provided, and that in the future we will be able to assess the national recovery and resilience plans, not only for their contribution to the greening of the economy and to digitalization, but also to the reduction of poverty. Finally, I had an excellent discussion with Mr. Pascal Donoghue, the president of the Eurogroup, on the role of the European Stability Mechanism, which, as you know, has been heavily criticized during the Greek tragedy of the years 2011, 2015, not least because the bailouts that were granted to Greece at the time had not been sufficiently attentive to the social impacts caused by the austerity measures that Greece, under the Memorandum of Understanding concluded, had agreed to implement. Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the European Commission, had announced in July 2014 that social impact assessments would systematically accompany such macroeconomic adjustment measures adopted by states to comply with such memoranda of understanding. However, we do not have, even following the revision of the treaty establishing the European Stability Mechanism, we do not have a commitment to systematically accompany these macroeconomic adjustment programs negotiated with the states that are supported by the CSM to assess their social impacts using social rights as a benchmark to assess those impacts. And so I very much hope that in the future the ESM can make such a commitment, which I should add is also one expectation that the Court of Justice of the EU has expressed, given that the institutions of the EU within the European Stability Mechanism should comply with the Charter of Fundamental Rights and take into account the impacts on fundamental rights of the programs adopted. In closing, I would like to say that the next few weeks and months will be very decisive to measure the commitment of the EU towards poverty reduction and the reduction of inequalities. We expect within the next few weeks, probably in March, the Commission to present a new initiative called the Child Guarantee, demanded by the European Parliament since 2015. And this Child Guarantee is meant to ensure that all children across the EU shall enjoy 5 essential safeguards: access to healthcare, access to education, access to early childhood education and care, access to adequate nutrition, and finally, access to adequate housing. And this is extremely important. I know that Commissioner Nicolas Schmit, with whom I discussed this issue at length, is very committed to this initiative. However, I would like to note 2 things. First, providing such guarantees without explicit measures to ensure that families in poverty will effectively have access to the benefits that are normally allowable or accessible to them may be problematic. We see very high rates of non-take-up of rights across the EU because families in poverty do not have the right documentation, they don't have access to internet services, they fear contact with social services and do not dare to ask for help, they are ashamed, they are frightened of using the rights that they have on paper. So we need to make sure that the benefits that exist in principle, in theory, are effectively accessible by families in poverty. And secondly, I think it's difficult to distinguish supporting children with these 5 key guarantees from protecting parents' right to a decent income, decent jobs, and adequate minimum income schemes to ensure income security for the family. A child born in poverty is imposed a sentence for a crime that he or she has not committed, and it is a lifelong sentence because we know that being raised in poverty has impacts on the child's development and on his or her ability to later make a decent living. We also shall see in the next few months another initiative from the European Commission, which will be on minimum income schemes across the EU. Now, we have wide disparities across the EU in this area of minimum income schemes, with only 2 countries, the Netherlands and Ireland, that have minimum income schemes that are above the monetary poverty rate of 60% of median income. All other countries score less well, and no less than 7 of the EU 27 member states have minimum income schemes below 40% of the median income, which is even further below the poverty rate. And so the ambition of the Commission should be, in my view, to ensure not harmonization, of course, but some degree of upwards social convergence in this area. We need the minimum income schemes to be increased in order to effectively protect people from poverty. And there are instruments in international human rights law that provide guidance on this, which I believe the Commission could use more effectively to create a consensus across states around this issue. My hope, and that was my request to Commissioner Schmit, is that the Commission can propose a binding instrument, a framework directive on minimum or adequate minimum income schemes across the EU in order to ensure that states take seriously their responsibilities towards people in poverty. Finally, we expect the Commission to adopt an action plan on the European Pillar of Social Rights in the next few months, probably to be unveiled at the social summit organized by the Portuguese presidency of the EU in May in Porto. There are very high expectations concerning this action plan, and I very much hope that this action plan can be the much-awaited successor to the Europe 2020 strategy by setting a target for poverty reduction across the EU. I would advocate for a commitment that by 2030 we reduce by 50% the number of people at risk of poverty in the EU. This number, 92 million, is still unacceptably high, and we can achieve much better, provided we do not see growth as the precondition for everything else, and provided we do not fool ourselves by thinking that growth and jobs creation will immediately and automatically be reflected in improved poverty numbers. So with this, I would like to close. This mission shall lead to me presenting a report to the Human Rights Council in Geneva in June, in a few months, although the report might be unveiled at the Social Summit in Porto on 8th and 9th of May. And I very much hope that this report will support the most progressive voices within the EU institutions, many of whom I met during my mission, and will allow us to seize this unique opportunity of the crisis to rethink quite fundamentally the direction in which the EU is moving. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward, of course, to our exchanges.
So thank you very much, Professor De Schutter, for this sobering report on poverty in the European Union and your valuable recommendations. We now have until 11:20 for questions and answers, so plenty of time, and we have questions that have come to us online as well as here in the room. So we'll first take the question from this gentleman here.
My name is Andy Verboot, and I want to ask you something regarding the European Stability Pact, because there was a recommendation from the European Commission that all the support measures for the companies in need should end the end of this year. From 2022, there would be no support measures anymore. What do you think that the impact would be on poverty as a whole?
Well, thank you. State aid has been a very important part of the tools that states could use in order to mitigate the impacts of the crisis on people. And the amounts involved are extremely high, especially for the wealthiest countries, such as Germany, that accounts for about half of state aids provided across the EU. And one difficulty of state aid is that, of course, it magnifies differences between countries, because countries such as Greece or Italy cannot support their companies the way Germany does. Moreover, I must regret that there was only one recommendation from the European Commission concerning how the money should be spent, recommending that states do not support companies that invest in tax havens. But apart from the follow-up that shall be given to that recommendation, I note that tax havens are defined based on the blacklist of the European Commission that is extremely contestable, and the way it was defined was not very transparent. So I'm not sure the current mechanism of state aid is really working ideally. However, I do believe it's been a very important tool states could use immediately after the start of the crisis. And the fear is that the crisis will worsen the poverty figures as more and more companies will fall bankrupt in autumn of this year, in the start of 2022. So it is extremely worrying that we are going to see a second wave of social impacts once that support given to the economy will be phased out. So we have to do this very carefully. I do insist on the fact that some companies have been supported despite them having no commitment to the ecological transition. For example, fossil energy, petrol companies or airline companies. And we should invest the money we have to support the social and solidarity economy, companies that make commitments to green the economy, companies, in other terms, that represent the future rather than the past. And I would note that many of these companies create more jobs and of course, work to prepare Europe to meet future challenges.
Thank you, Professor. We've received a number of questions online. Je voudrais vous dire que vous pouvez également poser vos questions en français et Professeur De Schutter sera heureux de répondre en français. So we have a question here from Milan Zverepa. Reading the preliminary statement, there is one mention of disability. Given the link between disability and poverty, how is the issue taken into account in the report?
So the report is not written yet, and I very much hope to develop that aspect more thoroughly in the report. What you have here is a preliminary conclusions, not the final report. It's clear that people with disabilities are very much more at risk of poverty than others, and it is extremely important that we focus on their specific needs. I met with the European Disability Forum, and I met with people with disabilities, and I was shocked to hear that disability benefits were sometimes seen as allowing them to pay for their electricity or their housing, when that should not be the purpose of disability allowances. My esteemed colleague, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Professor Gerard Quinn, is planning to visit the EU, and I hope that he, in his own mission, will be able to do a much more detailed examination of this issue, and we will work collaboratively to make sure that that issue is included in the report I shall submit as part of this mission.
Thank you. We also have a question from Aija, which I think you have already addressed in your talk, but you might want to complete it. Could universal basic income be an acceptable tool for combating poverty and inequality?
There are many debates around universal basic income, and it was an interesting part of the discussions around the response to the COVID-19 pandemic that this issue came to the fore of the political discussion. I think it can be a powerful tool to ensure that people are protected from extreme destitution, but I would warn against the gender impacts that this may have if the universal basic income is presented or understood as a wage that people are paid to stay at home. The gender impacts could be regressive. So it's extremely important to ensure that the universal basic income does not discourage people from seeking to flourish by taking up employment and gaining greater economic independence in that sense. I personally think the focus of a universal basic income scheme should be really on the youth. Those that are between 18 and 25 years of age make choices in life, where to study, what to study, if to study or to work, where to work, that should not be dependent on their material needs. And so providing those young people with support, allowing them to make a decent living without having to depend on remunerative employment seems to me absolutely essential. I do not understand, for example, why in France, and I spoke to Christine Jantet, the French interministerial delegate on extreme poverty, who deplored that in France the minimum income scheme, revenu social d'intégration, was not available to young people below 25 years of age. The theory being that these people should be supported by their parents. Well, poverty rates in France amongst that category of people is very high, about 30%. And so I think it's really there that the focus should be.
Merci. Nous avons deux questions de José Montoya. Il demande d'une part quel serait l'impact de la pandémie du coronavirus sur la pauvreté. Et la deuxième question, quel mécanisme pourrait adopter la population vulnérable pour faire respecter ses droits humains et les restrictions aux libertés?
Well, I think we all know from various studies, including in particular in the UK and in France, which I read, that people in poverty are the most affected by the pandemic. They are most affected because they are often manual workers who cannot telework, because they live in crowded buildings in which different generations coexist. And they are most affected because they are not best covered by by healthcare and may not be able to respect all the social distancing recommendations or physical distancing recommendations that are addressed to the rest of the population. Moreover, in some countries for which we have data, we note that the comorbidities are more important amongst people in poverty, who are more than the rest of the population subject to obesity or to other comorbidities, and so they are more affected by the virus. So already in this regard, people in poverty are being particularly impacted by the pandemic. But moreover, most people who are in precarious forms of employment, mini jobs as they are called in Germany, or 0-hour contracts, or workers in the platform economy, are people that were already at risk of poverty with very low wages and certainly uncertain wages in the past. And these were, in many cases, the workers most affected by the lockdowns and the economic downturn that we witnessed. So unfortunately, we have seen the figures of people in poverty increase. We've seen the queues lengthen in front of the food banks, and in all EU countries, this has been a very strong pressure exercised on social services. As I said earlier in answer to another question, we shall witness a second wave of poverty increase as a result of companies having to declare bankruptcy. Probably later this year, there will be more bankruptcies to be deplored with higher unemployment figures as a result. So I have extreme worries in this regard.
Thank you. We have a comment from Luis Martin Alvarez, who says, as a social pediatrician, I hope that the issue of children in poverty will be addressed. And then we have a very specific comment from Anne van Lanker. Thank you for your support for a framework directive on minimum income. What kind of instrument in international law were you referring to when you mentioned a benchmark for adequacy?
Indeed. Well, I do believe that child poverty is extremely important, and it is why I place so many hopes in the Child Guarantee Initiative, which should oblige member states to explain on a yearly basis the strategies they are deploying to provide children with these 5 basic guarantees I've mentioned. As to the question of Anne van Lanker, there are, under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, there are quite precise definitions of what adequate minimum income should consist in, corresponding to the necessities of life and the possibility for the worker and his or her family to be economically secure by gradually saving some money and building up some assets. And there's guidance there, there's methodology, there are methodologies there that could be used. It strikes me that in the social field, many of the objectives that the European Commission is seeking to achieve by trying to create a consensus across member states could be more easily achieved perhaps by referring to the obligations states already have under international human rights law, but are often ignoring or ignorant of, although such standards exist. And that is also true for the minimum wage debate. We have very clear guidance from the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of the UN on how that should be calculated in the form of a living wage. And I think that could be a source of inspiration for the instruments proposed by the European Commission.
So we have a follow-up question on minimum wage from Ryan Broadhurst, who asks, aside from just working towards a minimum wage union-wide, is there not other mechanisms that can be used, for instance, working towards a system of housing which guarantees tenure?
There are many tools that could be used in order to reduce poverty, including at-work poverty across the EU. And which tools can be used will depend, of course, or does depend on the competences that the EU has and the competences instead that the member states retain. One tool that until now has not been sufficiently explored, I believe, is the European semester, under which the Council of the EU addresses country-specific recommendations to the member states in order to achieve economic convergence, but also upwards social convergence. Now, that is a way to address messages to states, including to combat homelessness, even in the absence of binding instruments adopted by the EU, even in the absence of competences at EU level. And until now, these country-specific recommendations were seen as a very soft instrument. Countries were sometimes ignoring such country-specific recommendations when they were not considered acceptable or desirable to them. But now, with the next generation EU instruments, and particularly the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the member states shall have to show that the investments they make in the use they make of European funds will comply with the country-specific recommendations they are addressed. So these CSRs will become much more, if not binding upon them, at least they will be taken much more seriously because they are a condition for receiving European funds and being allowed to spend those funds. And so I believe more could be done. For example, I recommend that we address strong country-specific recommendations to the countries who practice fiscal dumping beyond aggressive tax planning strategies by companies. I think more should be done to encourage them to adopt progressive taxation income schemes. And I believe more should be done using country-specific recommendations to combat homelessness and to ensure that countries raise wages in accordance with productivity gains. And I think much could be done under the European semester to socialize it further and to ensure upwards social convergence.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Graciela Malgesini Rey. She uses some abbreviations that perhaps you might wish to explain. Do you think that FEAD and the new ESFR Plus will help in reducing poverty? How should they be oriented to achieve this 50% poverty reduction goal that you mentioned?
Yeah. This question is a bit premature in the sense that there are now negotiations taking place between the Council, the Commission and the Parliament on the European Social Fund Plus. And the acronyms refer to the European Fund to aid the most deprived, Fonds Européen pour l'aide aux plus démunis, FEAD, that would be supported under this European Social Fund Plus proposal. It is uncertain yet what the result of this trilogue will be between the three institutions, so it's premature for me to comment. But of course, I believe it's a very important tool that should be strengthened, and this will be part of my final report.
Thank you. We have a few more questions and about 10 minutes left. So we have a question from Tanya Giacomuzzi Mota. Could you kindly further elaborate on the international human rights mechanisms that provide guidance on the harmonization of the minimum income scheme and other social rights standards?
Right. So I will be quite detailed on this in my report, but let me just mention that was also the question of Anna van Lancker, that we have in UN instruments, in particular, a general comment of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, general comment number 19 on the right to social security, that was adopted in 2008 and provides very good guidance on what minimum income schemes should look like. We also have, of course, the International Labour Organization instruments, the ILO Social Security Minimum Standards Convention number 102 and recommendation 202 on social protection floors adopted in 2012. These are instruments that have been endorsed by the member states of the EU, that are binding on the member states of the EU when they are binding instruments. And in some ways, sometimes the EU may be seen as, or perceived from the outside as, reinventing the wheels, trying to make up new standards, although these standards are found in in international human rights law within UN or ILO instruments.
Thank you. And we have a question from Ekaterina Nazibulina. Will the report explore the connection between poverty and refugee status?
Well, the report will emphasize that refugees and migrants, including undocumented migrants, should be treated with dignity and should have access to a basic set of standards that were actually listed by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of the UN in a declaration that was adopted in 2016, where reference is made to the minimum protection that undocumented migrants inter alia should have. And already in the concluding or the preliminary conclusions that are sent out, I believe there is a reference to that declaration or that statement. I don't have it now in front of me, but there will be some guidance in my final report on this, yes.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Heather Roy. How have you seen the role of social services in addressing poverty, and will you have recommendations on this?
Yes, so I will have recommendations on this, and I would like to, without prejudging the exact formulations I shall use, mention two things here. First, I am really struck and in fact shocked to see that since 2009, I haven't looked at the figures before that, but the funding going to social services has been decreasing. States have tried to achieve what is called euphemistically cost effectiveness in the provision of social services, but the result is that people working in social services, social workers, are exhausted. These services are understaffed and under-resourced. And I think this is part of the reason why we have failed to make significant gains in the fight against poverty. And my second remark is that as a result of the changing face of the welfare state, in which social aid and unemployment benefits are increasingly made conditional upon the beneficiaries complying with certain conditions, social workers sometimes see themselves as the gatekeepers, having to ensure that people do not abuse the system. And this distorts the kind of relationship they can have with families in poverty who may fear contacts with social services that are perceived sometimes as there to monitor their behavior or to ensure that they comply with conditionalities or that they do not cheat the system. Social workers should be encouraged to support families by being extremely active in trying to find solutions for them, which requires more resources, human and financial, and which requires that they build a relationship of trust with the families in poverty that sometimes is not there. I met families who do not dare to speak to social workers because they fear they will be denounced, and that, for example, the child may be removed from the family because the child is at risk in a family in poverty. That is absolutely not acceptable and makes the work of social workers impossible. So yes, in answer to Heather Roy, I believe this should be emphasized in the report I shall prepare.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Frédéric Hanotier asks, what is your view of the role of local authorities and the way they design and implement local policies to address poverty and inclusion?
Yes, thank you for this question. I had two excellent meetings with two important networks, Eurocities on the one hand and Human Rights Cities Network on the other hand, both of which were extremely instructive. And I'm struck by the fact that local entities, municipalities, were not involved in the shaping of national recovery and resilience plans that countries are now preparing under the Recovery and Resilience Facility of the EU. This is a missed opportunity because these municipalities play a hugely important role in providing support to families in areas such as healthcare, education, access to employment, housing. It is estimated that 60% of the financial support that goes to families in poverty actually is in the hands of municipalities. So these are key actors in the fight against poverty at the local level that should be consulted much more by states preparing their national plans. And secondly, I'm struck by the fact that municipalities have been experimenting with new schemes but are not sufficiently encouraged to experiment with the right to fail when you experiment, despite the huge benefits we would have from allowing these experiments to develop into new social innovations that can be replicated elsewhere. Let me take one example. The adoption in France of a law on territories zero long-term unemployed, territoire zéro chômeur de longue durée. This was initially in a dozen of municipalities in France. It's now been expanded to some 60 municipalities. And it is an experiment by which the local municipalities invest in creating jobs for people who are long-term unemployed, because they know that it is more costly to have someone who's unemployed, with all the depression, the health problems, the violence this may result in addition to unemployment benefits having to be paid. It's more costly than to create employment for these people and provide, therefore, better services to the population, or invest more work in the ecological transition. So, Territoire Zéro Chômeur de Longue Durée is a very promising experiment led in France that many municipalities across Europe could benefit from learning from. And in my discussion with Christine Jantet, again, the French interministerial delegate in the fight against poverty, she mentioned that this experiment was one that could be expanded to create territories with no non-take-up of rights, right? Areas in the country where the municipality would commit to all beneficiaries of social aid actually receiving that aid, receiving the benefits they have a right to without anyone left behind, and which requires a proactive approach towards people who are the beneficiaries to inform them about their rights and help them overcome the hurdles they experience in trying to exercise those rights. So I believe, in other terms, that municipalities, because they can experiment and because they can launch social innovations, are a hugely important part of the toolbox we have to combat poverty and should be recognized as such.
Thank you. We have only 2 minutes left and just 2 more questions, so we have time for 1-minute answers to each question. Margot asks, should we not focus on fighting extreme wealth to tackle extreme poverty? And she refers to the last Oxfam report. And the other question is, more generally, you have been meeting with civil society organizations. What is emerging from what you have heard?
So on the first question, I believe we all are concerned about the growth of inequalities. And Europe is not faring particularly badly in comparison to other world regions, but even in Europe, despite the robust welfare states we have and the important role that tax and transfer schemes play in alleviating poverty, we still have witnessed growing inequalities since the mid-1980s. And that is a source of concern. What is important to emphasize is that first, people in poverty are less interested in the absolute poverty in which they may find themselves, which is referred to in statistics in Europe as extreme deprivation. Then they are interested in relative poverty. Right? People measure their situation by comparing their situation at the bottom of the social ladder with that of others. So it matters to people that we live in more equal societies. Secondly, people who are the wealthiest in society design very clever strategies to limit their tax liabilities, and it is not unusual for these people to pay lower taxes in proportion to their income than the middle class. And that is also unacceptable. This is why we need to pursue the efforts to combat tax avoidance and aggressive tax planning strategies. This is true for corporations, but it's equally important for high wealth individuals. And let me simply note that it's been shown, for example, by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson in the UK, and the Equality Trust that they set up, that societies that are more equal are much better equipped to address social challenges, such as to combat crime, obesity, teenage pregnancy, depression, and so on. In other terms, more equal societies are not only better for people in poverty, they are better for all of us, and we can much better react to challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic if we are more equal societies and if we therefore share a sense of belonging to a same community. The final question was, one word?
You've been meeting with civil society
Yes,
organizations.
civil society.
What is emerging from what you have heard? Very, very briefly, please.
Yes, so these were extremely moving testimonies I received from people who felt that Europe was not working for them. And I think the level of participation in the shaping of the national responses to the crisis was minimal, or perceived as minimal, for people in poverty and for the practitioners of poverty. And this is regrettable, because these people have enormously valuable knowledge to bring to the table. Their experiences can allow policymakers to design solutions that are much better informed by what people experience in daily life. Let me provide one very simple example. If you create jobs in a region that gains prosperity by investments being attracted, but these jobs are not in the middle of the city, but are in the outskirts, in industrial zones in which companies are present, and you don't have a car to travel to that place of employment because the public transport services have been underfunded, you will not have access to these opportunities. And that is the kind of very banal reality that people in poverty face every day. Being in poverty makes it much more difficult for you to seize the opportunities, particularly the job opportunities that are created by overall progress. And so I think it's extremely important to listen to their experience, to listen to their experience also in seeking to claim the benefits they have a right to. I've been referring to the phenomenon of non-take-up of rights a few times already, and I think it's very important not to confuse the legal coverage that our welfare systems ensure with the effective coverage of people. Very often, being poor makes it more difficult for you to have access to certain benefits, and this results in a Matthew effect in which, in fact, many schemes, however generous they are, will benefit the middle class more than people in extreme poverty.
We've run out of time, and Professor, I know you have a busy schedule of interviews ahead of you, so I want to thank you for your presentation, for the important work that you're doing, and we certainly look forward to your report that will be delivered to the UN in June. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for following this press conference.